So good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this webinar jointly organized by the UCD Centre for Human Rights and the UCD Centre for Equality Studies. I'm Associate Professor Marie-Luce Paris in the UCD Sutherland School of Law and also Director of the UCD Centre for Human Rights. My colleague, Dr. Ruben Flores, represents the Centre for Equality Studies. I'm delighted to welcome our guest speaker tonight, Professor Kathleen Lynch, who is Professor Emerita of Equality Studies at UCD and also a commissioner at the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission. Professor Lynch has devoted her life's work to promoting equality, human rights and social justice, and not only through education, but also through her widely reputed research work. So she will present tonight a recent book entitled Care and Capitalism, published in 2021 by Polity. The aim of your book, Kathleen, and very briefly, is to critically analyze the logics and ethics of neoliberal capitalism and to reclaim the language of care, love, and solidarity, both intellectually and politically, and to place it at the heart of contemporary discourse. We are also delighted that the discussion around the book will see the contributions of Professor Diane Reay and Professor Jonathan Herring. Professor Diane Reay is a sociologist mainly working in the area of education and educational inequalities in particular. Professor Herring is Professor of Law at Exeter College of the Oxford University, and he researches in different areas of law, including legal ethics, vulnerability law, and care and the law. Thank you all for having accepted our invitation. So I suppose I will talk about a few housekeeping matters before we start. On the right-hand side of the screen, you will see more details about the book and the bios. And Kathleen will talk about the book for about 30 minutes, and then we will have the two discussants who will be invited in turn to present their comments, starting with Professor Reay first. You are welcome to ask your questions via the Q&A function that will be monitored by my colleague Ruben. And we hope to have at least 10 minutes or so just after 6 to have the discussion around your questions. So the webinar is being recorded and there will be screenshots taken of the presenter and discussants. So thank you, and Kathleen, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Marie-Luce. Thank you for inviting me to speak, and thank you very much, Diane and Jonathan, for agreeing to be respondents, and of course to Ruben as well for all the organising. I'm very happy to begin to share my screen and talk about the book, if that's okay with you. I'll just do that now. Thank you. I'm here to talk about this book. Of course, it is something that has been very close to my heart for a long time. And I suppose I'll begin by saying why I wrote it, and this is roughly an outline. Of course, I can't deal with every single topic in the book in detail, but I'll try and synopsize the main arguments. I suppose I began because as a founder of Equality Studies in UCD and the School of Social Justice originally, I have a huge interest in the issue of inequality and social justice. And I want to talk about why the concept of effective equality emerged and why, related to that, the whole question of love, care and solidarity is so important, I think, politically and intellectually for social justice. But relatedly, I suppose, I've written a lot on education, as Diane Reay and I share probably similar backgrounds in sociology, challenging much of neoliberal capitalism and how it operates in education. But I wanted to articulate its logics and morality and to position them and how they threaten the whole ethic of care in society and indeed globally, and to make the case moving beyond capitalocentric thinking to care-centric and social justice-oriented politics of social change. And to argue, I suppose, that care is a residual value that can be politicized. I think that's very important, that we have hope and that we don't just do a critique, because mobilization intellectually and politically matters, to highlight some of the care-specific movements and resistors to capitalism, and then to draw some conclusions. So I suppose to begin with was a theoretical interest I had to create a dialogue, because as a feminist, I suppose, as well as a socialist, I was really aware that a lot of left-wing thinkers ignored feminism and ignored the major contribution of care feminist scholars, especially in egalitarian political theory, in which I was directly involved with my colleagues and John Baker, Judy Walsh and Sarah Cantillon when we wrote Equality from Theory to Action. And it was, so that is, I suppose, to bring the idea of relational justice, which of course John has written a book on, and its importance, to the attention of scholars in the social sciences, I suppose, which is my own field especially. And to challenge as well the hegemony of neoliberalism in the academy and political resignation, I suppose. I know many people are doing that, but to challenge capitalist-centric thinking, because I think it pervades an awful lot of our discourses. And I believe that mobilization for social justice is intellectual and political and social, but I regard education as very central to it. So, and they demonstrate how relational justice is deeply embedded with other injustices. Now, I may not have time to discuss that today, but I think it is very important to recognize, I suppose we wrote about intersectionality nearly in 2004 when we published Equality from Theory to Action, and I briefly refer to that. I also felt I wrote this book not because of COVID, actually, because I started it a while before COVID, but there is a global care crisis, both in so-called poorer countries because they're poorer, but also because of the global migration of care workers, often leaving their own people to care for rich people in Europe and rich countries. And of course, there is a global care crisis in Western countries arising from age and gender politics and a whole variety of other things. So I want to begin with talking about liberalism, care and neoliberalism. I think one of the things I have felt is that care work and respect for it, and carers in particular, was never part of the liberal political agenda. It was not seen as a public and political matter or a matter of social justice. Seen as private and ethical matter, something that was done largely by women, but didn't require mind work. And go back to Descartes, I suppose, and Ray's cogitans. It wasn't seen to be something, or that should be cogitans, I think, rather than tans. Liberalism built on that abjection of care from the 16th and 17th century. So I think that's something that a lot of people who critique kind of theories of justice do not recognize the origins of neoliberalism and its link to liberalism. I think they're reflected in the fact that community and public dimensions of care work, including care-related service, were often seen as incidental, certainly in our society, and except for a handful of welfare states provided by charities. The public side of care, the solidarity side, was seen to be a charitable extra. And this kind of thinking, of course, is not to combine to liberals, because it's also very much true of Marxist thinking, because care is not defined as productive work, and is seen as not having an exchange value. And I suppose my concern, living as I have lived a long time and worked in academia and in communities and elsewhere, that neoliberal is not just an analytical model of Hayek and others, it's also a normative framework. It's deeply embedded. I think that's the difference between it, we'll say, and conventional or historical capitalism. It's embedded in language and in discourse, and in a way that is quite unique, and which I'll talk about, and it prescribes who you should be and how you should be. And what I suppose I come from the theories of justice side is that, especially post-Rawls, the focus has primarily been on distributive justice, to a lesser degree, respect and recognition, such as the work of Honneth. But both traditions, and indeed the neo-Marxists, are based on ontological assumptions, which I think are very problematic. Cartesian rationalism, the cognitive rational view of the person, Homo sapiens, and, as Joan Tronto has documented, the disregard for the rationality of caring and feeling, and Martha Nussbaum as well, Homo curans, and the related morality that comes from our relationality. So that also its assumption of the autonomous view of the person, little attention given to the vulnerability of the human subject. And the person is often assumed to be non-relational in their decisions that were driven by self-interest, power, status, and money, especially in sociology, is the assumption, rather than other central interests. And of course, that the citizen that count is a public adult citizen. We see that in that children are often not defined as who are fully citizens who can enter into contract, because that is what a lot of social justice talks about, is about adults. What about people with intellectual disabilities, people who do not have the capacity to enter into contract? So I suppose what I felt is here is these four major systems of injustice are very much the top three, part of sociological thinking: resource inequalities related to class in particular, respect and recognition of differences, the political system, representation and inequalities, where you seek parity of representation in the exercise of power. But the affective system, the relations inequalities in the doing and receiving, because there has been a lot written about the doing in the gender sense, but very little written, in my view, or insufficient, of course there's something written, about the need for care as a basic human need, and in my view, a human right. And this is the model, I suppose, that we have developed, and I don't have time to now, but people want to look at it. The idea is that there are generative sites of injustice, certain groups. The economic system has the generative site of injustice for social class, but it impacts on every other site. You have less respect and recognition. Your clothes, your dress, your accent, where you come from, you don't get given the same credibility in politics. And of course, it affects your relational life, because when poverty comes in the door, often love runs out the window, as people don't have time for such luxuries as giving time and attention to others. So I'm saying all of these systems, like I would regard children as the quintessential example, or intellectually disabled persons, the very ill and stateless persons who are representationally powerless. They don't often have a say in governing where they go or what they do, but this also impacts on their relationships, because they have no say as to who their parents are, often how they cared for them, or what kind of care they receive, even especially as intellectually disabled or stateless persons. Equally, I just want to mention the cultural system, I think, is well rehearsed, and there are many people who are the generative source, but of course it affects everywhere else. If you're gay, whether or not you can come out openly and get a job, and what type of job, etc. Whether you can go into politics, whether you can have relationships, intimate relationships, depending on what country you're living in. But the affective system is hugely important, because it is the work that's involved in creating us in our humanness. And this is the work that women, there are two parts to it, I argue, the work that women and girls do disproportionately, as the Oxfam report of 2020 presented at Davos documented, but also those who are deprived of the right to care, people in asylum often, people who are homeless, and especially, because I have a lot of experience of prisons, people who are incarcerated. So I'm just saying, I wanted to show that they're intersectional, but maybe to leave that there for now. And of course, that affects everything else, because if you're not loved and cared for, it's often very hard to have that sense of importance, value, and security that enables you often to participate in other walks of life. So affective equality, which is the subtitle of the book and why it matters for social justice, is a challenge, I think, to mainstream theories of justice. And I'm not alone in saying this. Lots of people are writing about it, but I suppose I was trying to bring that thinking together. That humans live in profound states of interdependence and dependence. And affective relationality frames our social dispositions and choices. We are not, as it's drawn on empirical research. I've taken my colleagues in for affective equality, that book, but also New Managerialism, which was a study of senior management posts in schools and universities and higher education, and how people saw their relational lives. So people are very aware of their vulnerability, and that they are dependent at times, and at all times partially dependent. They're sentient, emotional and moral beings, and that informs judgment. So what I'm saying is, when we recognize the relationality of people, we recognize how all our actions are interdependent, not just, of course, with other humans, but within the environment and with other species, but it brings a normative dimension to decision making. I think, and we recognize that people have relational lives, and they make decisions often in the interests of others. And as I said in the book, while we're self-interested, we are not wholly or totally self-interested. And I don't want to go into these definitions in too much time, because I've distinguished in other early work between primary care relations, love relations, where there's high interdependency, great attachment and responsibility, and that love laboring is the work undertaken to create, maintain and enhance primary relations, and that this work is non-substitutable, inalienable and non-commodifiable. And I can explain that if people wish. But that is obviously the relation between children and parents is a very good example of this. And of course, these relations can be harmful, they can be neglectful, and they can be abusive. They go along a continuum from extreme care and protection to, of course, neglect and abuse. Secondary care relations are lower order, second order, where we're involved in relations with other people, usually by association, not involving long-term dependency needs. Our community and professional work, our neighbours, and among colleagues. And finally, there is the tertiary care sphere of the political and the regional and the global ultimately refer to relations of solidarity that do not involve face-to-face contact, but it's the possession of love and in politically and generally personally unknown others. These are not sacrosanct spaces, these three spaces, because of course, you can have a secondary care relationship where a carer of an older person moves into, becomes their primary carer. They become the person, and I give examples we do and publish work on empirical research of people who mutate between these, especially between the secondary and the primary. And of course, the effect of tertiary sphere matters enormous, because if we have a careless political system, then this undermines the other two spheres of care. So I said, the reason I think they matter, they're foundation for the production of life in its human form. Sociable beings do not exist prior to their relatings. I think Margaret Mead, the anthropologist, said that a long time ago. They involve work, physical, mental, emotional, that requires attentiveness and responsiveness, and they're productive. They are visible, especially in their absence. Of course, we hold people responsible for that, but often the structures of society do not enable them to receive what kind of care that they need. And so I'm thinking of the epidemiological research at the level by Wilkinson and Pickett on 2009, 2018, showing how economically unequal societies, for example, produce adverse effects on mental health, rising imprisonment, and even exaggeration in the rates of violence. Because carelessness and the indifference of not recognizing our relationality leads and certainly facilitates that kind of thinking. But the other reason, of course, it matters is that women are the default carers in all society, both in primary and secondary sphere, but also in many societal movements for solidarity. So what I'm saying is, I think that's why I think it matters in social justice terms. Now I want to comment on neoliberal capitalism. Many of you know this, so I'm not going to labor the point. We know that at the political level from, variety of studies across the world, that capitalism contributes to the corrosion of democracy as the super rich can collectively and manipulatively and individually manipulate politics, the media and public opinion, which has led, as we know, to massively rising inequalities in the world at the moment that fuels terrorism and, of course, the rise of the populist right. And in the world of nation states, capitalism fuels war, conflict, militarism, imperialism as ways of consolidating monopolies in geopolitical terms. And inevitably, it just, of course, like all capitalism, it promotes the privatization of assets. But what's unique is that it has promoted the privatization of public assets, especially public utilities, as we've seen happen in many countries, but even most recently, and then from the 90s onwards in Sweden, where you have the privatization of commercialization of schools, and of course, the privatization of a lot of commercialization of healthcare, which is really extensive in our own country. But it also produces logic. What matters not just the institutional impact, it has its logic, which I think it pervades other institutions. No matter whether you love or hate neoliberalism, it doesn't matter, because its logic is pervasive. It's cultural logic, even in voluntary and community services, as we see it in our universities, where they have, in a way, been forced to take on the Marxist logic because it is the dominant logic of the time, even though they do not often subscribe to that intellectually or politically. And so what we have is this idea of diminishing the state, a small, cheap state with poorer welfare and poorer investment in public services. But it's at the personal level that it has a huge impact. And this is, again, something I document its own morality. It is non-relational ontology underpins its concept of polity. It validates ambition, competition as virtues, endorsing entrepreneurial individualism and self-responsibilization. And of course, self-responsibilization is the morally lauded version of self-interest. It's a way of saying you can be look after yourself, it really matters, and therefore you are a moral person, which is another saying, a way of saying you are not responsible for others who are not in your immediate kith and kin. So it also builds on the idealization of choice, and we've seen that in various debates, even around today. There was a publication from UCD of a debate on the sexual exploitation and the prostitution industry, which is being relabeled, and the commercialization, very controversial issue. But it is about this value of choice has superseded the value of equality in many spheres, even among so-called left-wing and feminist thinking. And of course, the other very big feature of the ethic of neoliberalism is the ethic of time, because capitalism is speed-driven, linear, and time is linear and measurable. You're required to produce more and more in less and less time. That is, if you go back to Marx, the logic of capitalism. But it isn't just in capitalist business, it applies in public services, it applies in voluntary and community organizations. And it is the direct opposite of care time, because care time is fluid, relational, and cyclical. It doesn't have clear boundaries, and it is non-commodifiable. So I'm saying it is a completely different type of logic. And I often represent here visually at the top of the pinnacle of the human condition at the moment is this, going back to Becker, the economist, view of the rational economic actor model of the citizen, which is assumed to be, and that's what I say, the analytical becomes normative. That assumes to be the normative state for the human condition. Even though our cultural and political lives, our relational lives are made, especially the bottom, although it holds up the other two, it's made invisible in that tradition. So I'm saying it is, that's what I suppose, just a synopsis that I'm saying here, as the pursuit of personal ambition is equated with virtue. Everyone says you should be ambitious regardless of purpose. And self-interested now has mutated into self-responsibilization, which provides a moral rationale for that practice. And I think it generates the kind of carelessness and indifference to the suffering of humanity, but also other non-human species. An actuarial approach, a transactional approach to human relationships, what can I get out of it? Will I do or run a course in the university? Is it a good career? Will it be advantage? Will I, run the module, or is it not going to be in some actuarial way too high a risk? And I would argue, and this is what I'm working on, I hope another book before I'm too old, an education, but a new social nature that is hardwired to the myth of merit, that you own your personal success. And as I said, the hubris of the meritorian generates profound carelessness for those who are less successful than oneself. And I go back to Adorno, who talked about bourgeois coldness, and that political coldness is no longer just the preserve of the bourgeoisie, because it's universalized and morally sanctified. It's normalized for all classes of society, certainly in this country, which would have been unthinkable for all its faults and failings. Indeed, there were many a generation ago. But I don't want to lay everything at the door of capitalism, because that is wrong. Because care work has always been seen as low-grade work, and this is not unique to capitalism. But it's not seen as citizenship-defining work, and it's not seen to be fully human. The derogatory way in which people refer to housewives and domestic workers, and especially housewives, is a reflection of how they are not seen to be fully part of society, as that distinction drawn by in the 16th and 17th century between society and nature. Those who are fully human were part of society, and those who were not were part of nature. Women, indigenous people, and ethnic minorities were defined very much as part of nature, people who would be used by those who are part of society. And care work, and indeed manual work, which I think is another serious issue, our lack of respect for manual work, and care work involves manual work, or seem to be just natural dispositions that came to certain types of persons. And I'm saying what happens, of course, is under capitalism, it's exaggerated because it's institutionalized. And societies are driven by the demands of the accumulation process. That is the ethic of capitalism. And it's oriented to exchange. Production is oriented to exchange, not a use or provisioning. And therefore, there's disregard for care as a use value. And I think it assumes that unpaid care, family work, community work, and solidarity work is undertaken, but is not defined as real work. It seemed to be a secondary activity. So what I would argue is, I think there is a problem in those who dissent from the political part of Poe, and there are many critiques of capitalism, in that they don't offer us any, always clearly, I suppose that's what I have found in reading, and I quote both Diane and Jonathan in the book, they have started to ask about why do we have this ethic, and can we think about the world differently? And capital-centric thinking is where we define all the solutions as well as the problems in terms of capital-labor relations, as if the only social relations that we had for politics that matter are political and economic relations, and changing market relations. But yes, we need to change market relations, but meaning-making and life itself are not only produced in the market, they are produced through our care relational lives, even if they have been subsumed politically and subordinated intellectually. Caring for ourselves, other species, and the earth itself is foundational to the survival of humanity. And for my view, for that reason, we need to create and take that world out of the private sphere, and it's privatized even in the realms of solidarity and the political level, not just in the personal or family level or the community level, into the public sphere. And what I suppose I would argue is, contrary to what the Hobbesian view of society is, or indeed of the human condition is entirely self-interested, people are guided in their everyday lives by their relational commitment. Certainly that is the finding of a number of studies, including a more recent one that we've undertaken of academics and all scholars, not just scholars actually, but administrators, librarians, and people in higher education. People have been hardwired to think a particular way, but they can move beyond that. As my colleague Margaret Keane has written about, people have a care conscience, because care is a central trope around which moral conceptions of personhood, relationships, and society are anchored across many cultures, quoting from here. And I'm saying, like going back to what Raymond Williams, the British sociologist who wrote in the 60s, said there are residual cultural practices. They're mostly silent, but they can be enabled and resourced and endorsed to become politically public. And resurrecting the centrality of relationality, in my view, to the understanding what it means to live, and it's crucial to change in what it means to live a fully human life. So I'm just saying these residual values are there. Most people are not, even if they are forced to be self-interested, they are not actively so. But if we don't have created an alternative narrative, a new language, a new way of contesting public discourses that offers an alternative ethic, then there is no new intellectual space where people can go. And I'm saying most people's lives, actually, ordinary people's lives, even people who are quite powerful, are centered around their love and care relations. And solidarity is fundamental to sustainable living in politics, because even the most powerful are carers are cared for, even if in some shape or form, and at some time in their lives, they may have high dependency needs, and they certainly had them when they were babies. So I'm just saying, if we start to think the world and think of a different ethic in the public discourses and mobilize around it, I think we can have a very different world. And I'm listing here all the mobilizations: anti-racist, anti-patriarchal movements, environmental movements, the school strikes movement, indigenous and lands rights movement. During the COVID, there was a movement in Italy, the Caring Society movements, the cooperatives and common-based movements throughout Africa by women farmers, the Maya women in the Zapatista movement, the Eco Villages Network, the vegan movements, environmental protests. We're not without examples, but I think those who want to think about bring about change often do not bring a sufficient number of those into public discourse. And Bertrand Rollins and colleagues have documented this in relation to cooperatives in the field of the economy. The success of worker owner cooperatives, Mondragon, worker owner financial institutions such as Desjardins in Canada, cooperative business run by women in Rwanda, Brazil, and India, the Domestic Workers Federation, which has grown immensely in the United States, and cooperative home care associates. Even the Migrant Rights Centre here in Ireland, due to the exploitation of carers in domestic work, have started a home carers cooperative. So I'm saying there are examples. We're not, I could have many more. So I want to conclude by saying, why does a relational lens matter? Because the atomistic, bounded and self-contained concept of the person doesn't enable a full understanding of how our effective relational moral life is at the center of meaning-making in the human condition. Because it's time, I think, to rely on concepts of relationality and effective equality with concepts of independence and self-interest. And I think what I was saying, although it's not maybe primarily, I end in the book talking about this, I think it has enormous implications for university and for education. If you think of what we do in schools and colleges, most students are rewarded for their individual success. How they outcompete others from the time they're in primary school until they finish if they go to college. There are very few cooperative ventures, very few places where they're rewarded for a shared effort. And as Nancy Folmer, the feminist economist, said, altruism doesn't fall from the sky. We create it culturally and socially, and I believe that education is central to that. At the moment, if you study, as Diane knows, education, it is almost completely oriented. It has been captured, I would say, by neoliberal capitalism. And it is focused on producing human capital. It's in all the OECD, EU, and other publications of global corporate bodies that are involved in education. And I believe we need a new epistemology underpinning education. I think it would be a good way to start. It's certainly a place I suppose I know something about. But we learn to think relationally. If we started to think about the consequences of our relational actions, not just do we know the theories. And I think learning to do that, I think we have to learn to act it, not just to know it intellectually. And what I would call the naive intellectualism often of academia, that if we just teach people the right ideas, they will become moral. I don't think that's possible, because if you teach people for 14 years in education and then for another 4 in higher education or further education to be totally self-interested, why would they not become that way? Because that is what they're habitual, to go back to Bourdieu, their habitual dispositions are those of self-interest. So I'm just saying it is an enormous challenge, and but developing oppositional discourses of counter-hegemonic publics are necessary, I think, because we need to break the silence, and this commitment to what I call capitalist-centric thinking, which isn't just about political and economic institutions, it's about the way that we organize everyday life. So I think it is an enormous task because it has epistemic implications, it has legal implications, and it's about changing the dispositions and imaginations that will generate new ways of thinking, which I think it is possible to do so. So thank you very much for your attention. I hope I haven't gone over my time. Thank you very much.
It's indeed, it's perfect because it's just in that time limit. Thank you so much, Kathleen. It was fascinating. And I think the journey about the book and the reasons for writing the book and the sources of inspiration are as fascinating as the contents and the direction that you suggest. I'm bursting with questions and observations, but I would like to invite Professor Reay to make the comments on the book, and then after Professor Herring will be joining in the discussion as well. So thank you very much.
Wow, Kathleen, so much food for thought. Care and Capitalism is a searing attack on neoliberalism, but one that also provides a very strong and persuasive counter-narrative. The central message is that the dynamics of neoliberal capitalism preclude caring, not only institutionally, but also ideologically. And Kathleen quotes Wendy Brown, who describes neoliberalism as the rationality through which capitalism finally swallows humanity. And we see the consequences of that monstrous ingestion throughout the book in the cruelties and lack of care inflicted on the vast majority of humanity. Huge swathes of the population across the globe are now deemed to be neither worthy nor important enough to merit being cared for by those in power. Care and Capitalism does some very important ideological work, rebutting the dominant myths of neoliberalism. And one important incursion is the problematizing of charity. The growing emphasis on charity and volunteering in contemporary society sanctions complacency about inequality, self-satisfaction, and paternalism among those who give, and reinforces shame and a sense of powerlessness among those who receive. It also fails to recognise that practices of charitable giving and volunteering are differentially enabled and facilitated by levels of resources. They're much easier to engage in if individuals come from advantaged rather than disadvantaged backgrounds. Another is the debunking the fallacy that profits and profiteering constitute a social good. We've reached the parlous state in England where caring for looked after children with special needs now can cost up to £1 million per child per year. Vulnerability has been turned into a market opportunity to make enormous profits, with children and young people reduced to costs in the pursuit of profits. In Caring and Capitalism, we learn myriad reasons why profits and the preoccupation with profit is problematic, not least the many cruelties inflicted on both humans and non-humans. Profiteering deprives many people of a livelihood, healthcare, clean health and water and air, and subjects animals to torture and death. There's also a careful deconstruction of economics as a discipline in the book, revealing the many ways in which it's imbued with very high degrees of carelessness. The considered and reflexive intermeshing of gender, race, disability with social class in the analysis of care under capitalism results in a theoretical framework that is broad in scope while allowing for in-depth probing of issues. In particular, there's an elucidation of the reasons for and consequences of the feminization of care. We see how neoliberalism not only sanctions inequalities of class, race, gender, and ability, but actively encourages them. Care and Capitalism is a very important book in terms of theoretical understandings of the relationship between capitalism and caring. But it's also one that had a powerful impact on me personally. It revealed a contradiction that lies at the heart of not just me as a socialist feminist academic, but I suspect at the core of many academics who see themselves as progressive thinkers committed to a socially just society. Many of us have had to tear ourselves in half psychically in the attempt to separate off and defend the part of us committed to a fairer society and the common good, the self that strives for collegiality and collective action from the self that is routinely hyper-competitive and measurement obsessed. I'm afraid that the first thing I do in the morning is check the sleep score on my Fitbit before doing 50 press-ups and 50 sit-ups. My first 15 minutes out of bed is devoted to 14 different sorts of metrics. As Kathleen writes in Care and Capitalism, when competition is an outer imperative, a regulatory norm, it also takes an internalized form. It becomes a way of being human, a binary mindset of rating and competing for coveted positions is hardwired into everyday thinking, and I'm afraid my everyday thinking too. Many of us are schizophrenic cynics of the current cruel status quo, complying with its imperative in order to be seen to be successful individuals, whilst acting in whatever way we can to stem its worst excesses. But as we see throughout Care and Capitalism, neoliberalism is no normal state of affairs. It's a paranoid ideology based on fear, mistrust, alienation, and exploitation. Inevitably, it generates paranoid individuals who find it increasingly difficult to define themselves through what they have in common with others rather than through their differences. And Kathleen writes very powerfully about the damage inflicted on societies of valorising meritocracy. One consequence is that we have had decades of disrespect, distaste and disregard, blighting working class communities across the globe. Neoliberalism has thrived on the elitism and hierarchy already existing in society, whilst adding a newer layer of damage and destruction. As Kathleen points out, in a society where the main thing that matters is winning, those who are designated as losers feel ashamed, vulnerable, and humiliated. We've witnessed the divisive consequences in the UK. The cruelties of austerity inflicted by neoliberalism have led to a collective lashing out by the powerless against them who hold sway over them, tell them what to do, and control their lives from a distance. Brexit and the rise of populism are just two toxic consequences. The book exposes meritocracy for the cruel fantasy that it is. With the hegemony of neoliberal individualism has come the belief that we can break free from our past. The cruel fantasies perpetrated by the rich and powerful, from the Obamas to David Cameron and Boris Johnson, present a past that only gently touches our present and frees us to become whatever we desire. Both British and Irish society have made wholesale investments in meritocracy, believing that the best and brightest will inevitably rise. Yet, for most of us, the past grips like a vice. And this is not to espouse a belief in determinism. It doesn't have to be this way. The limited opportunities and economic cruelties exposed by past and present generations of working class families is a result of choices. But those choices have been made primarily by others with greater economic and political power. And as Kathleen argues so clearly, that careless elite is choosing with impunity to locate the responsibility for poverty and destitution elsewhere, with the poor and destitute themselves. I think that one of the hardest lessons to be learned from social mobility, drawing on Pierre Bourdieu's writing, is that freedom is not given. It's something you conquer collectively. And social mobility under neoliberal capitalism is never a collective act. It's isolating, guilt-inducing, and alienating. Habitus as the often uncontrolled return of the repressed. But as Care and Capitalism makes evident, that guilt and alienation is nothing compared to the intolerable costs of being poor and left behind. And in neoliberal societies, I think we see just how toxic that individualism has become. And there's a very powerful contrast throughout Kathleen's book between individualism and a more collective, solidarist caring. And the book also makes very clear that this division and divisiveness is not just an issue of class, but also, very importantly, one of race and also gender. And that race and is powerfully undescribed, I think, in the latest example of England's politics of performative cruelty. And we now have a government scheme to expel to camps in Rwanda a majority of the desperate refugees who reach our shores. And these are people who've taken enormous risks and incurred unbearable costs. And they merit care and compassion. But what neoliberal England is offering them is callous cruelty. And it's clear that we need new ways of revitalising what Kathleen calls a global desire for a new and more socially and environmentally fair way of organising the world. And there are glimpses of these, despite the all-pervasive neoliberal fog that clogs our lungs and clouds our vision. And the book references the growth of worker, owner and producer cooperative movements, as well as recent social movements like Black Lives Matter and Me Too. And I'm afraid I'm located in London, and I think my own country has been even less successful than Ireland in revitalising the common good. But even so, I think that despite the forensic analysis we get of neoliberal capitalism and the damage and destruction it's doing, Care and Capitalism as a book is also full of hope. And I want to end on a hopeful note and suggest that there are remnants of a very different sense of self in many working class communities across the globe to that of the neoliberal ideal. And the valorization of competitive individualism and personal ambition central to neoliberal ideology fits discordantly into many communities where the predominant sense of self is one that exists above all in connection with others. And throughout my 30 years of research into social class experiences in England, one enduring feature has been the much greater propensity of the poorer communities, the more disadvantaged communities, to draw on a collective we throughout their narratives, rather than the individualized I of their middle and upper class peers. And that's why I think neoliberalism often makes no sense in relation to what are deeply ingrained value systems within many working class and disadvantaged communities, where a different moral economy operates, not just in England, but as I say, more widely across the globe. And despite a degree of fragility, a sense of solidarity consistently works to bind these communities together, overriding internal divisions, especially at times when those communities are under threat. And you get a sense that the individual is pointless. It's the connection with others that gives life its values. And when these communities are thriving, those connections are imbued with practices of being cared for and caring for others. But the problem is currently in austerity-riven post-Brexit England, these communities have been increasingly stripped of the resources that enable their members to care for and be cared for. A commonplace saying is that societies end up with the leaders they deserve. But in a more accurate proposition in the 21st century would be that societies end up with the governments their rich and privileged minorities want, while the mass of citizens are denied the resources to make informed decisions. And as Kathleen points out, power and control are exercised through controlling the means of understanding, and educational systems across the globe are just not fit for purpose when it comes to education for a relational life as caring, interdependent, and compassionate human beings. Most educational systems are systematically failing to treat children and young people as human beings with rights. Schooling is failing children and young people from Chile to China, England to Ethiopia. It schools them in compliance and conformity with an unjust status quo, rather than equipping them with the tools to question collaborate, and think critically. So there are actually academy schools in England that make students chant "Silence is my natural state" before marching them into classrooms where they're expected not to speak for the duration of the lesson. One of the main bulwarks against such depredations of neoliberalism that Kathleen identifies and writes about is critical education. We desperately need to discover and implement the practices of freedom, enabling children and young people to engage critically and reflexively with the society they're part of, and to learn how to participate in transforming it for the better. Caring and Capitalism has its genesis in a long history of intellectual thinking on care, caring, and love labour that Kathleen has been at the heart of. I read with the shock of disbelief her description of the editors and reviewers of a journal she submitted a paper to in 1989, deciding that the use of the word love in an academic journal was over the top. Yet, it's primarily because of the extensive labour of love that Kathleen has engaged in over a period of 40 years that care has at last begun to move centre stage in criticisms of neoliberalism. Thank you very much, Kathleen.
Thank you very much, Diane. That's a beautiful, beautiful review, and that's a beautiful echo of all the problematics which are raised in the book. And I think it's important when you said that this book has an impact on the community of academics and also personally. And I think, yeah, I just gathered from this metrics obsession that is imposed on us in university, especially. And I think we can really feel it. You talk about also social mobility, very important, and the education. So I think we will have a lot of food for thought in the discussion. And now I would like to invite Professor Herring to make his comments. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and it's a real privilege to speak today. Thank you very much to Ruben and everyone else for organising the event. And thank you especially, above all, I suppose, to Kathleen for writing this wonderful book. Kathleen Lynch's book, Care and Capitalism, is urgent. It's a book for our times. It's a profound, provocative, perceptive book. A book that changes the reader and thereby should change the world. At the heart of the book is a call for a new narrative to change the ethics of capitalism in its current mutation. We need to build a care-centric, relational concept of the individual person and of the wider economic, socio-political, and legal order. That is a demand that becomes ever more urgent and timely, and is even more important today than when the book was published just a few months ago. This is an ambitious project, and rightly so. It's the kind of book that is definitely not the final word on the subject, and I regard that as a high compliment. It will spur much thought and no doubt many other books and articles. One of its great strengths is that the significance of this book extends beyond disciplines. It can be read by sociologists, political scientists, economists, historians, lawyers, philosophers, and the list goes on and on. It can be read for those by those coming from the right or the left or the center of the political spectrum. It's an open-hearted book. All readers will be urged to rethink their discipline, their area of research, and how it can be reimagined in a care-centric and relational way, recognizing that it is care and not money which should be the focus of our thoughts. And it extends that concept of care from care to others to care for the environment, animals, and the earth itself. I want to explore three themes raised in the book, which have encouraged me as a lawyer to rethink how the law works, But I hope I've chosen topics which will be comprehensible to people who are coming from other disciplines. And I offer these simply as some of the kinds of rethinkings that Kathleen's book could encourage. First of all, the relational self. Kathleen argues that neoliberal capitalism is closely aligned to the concept of the atomistic self. And as she said, it's one of the first tasks is to challenge that concept of the self and replace it with an understanding of the relational self. The atomistic understanding of the self claims that we are self-made. We develop our own values, thoughts, and identity, and we engage with the world from that. And that's certainly how the law sees us. The understanding of the law of the self is of an isolated, independent, self-sufficient, autonomous man. The rights that the law provides are designed to protect that man. Those rights of autonomy, of privacy, of self-determination are all designed to keep others away, to preserve independence. But they are utterly unsuited for the reality of our lives, which are caring, where autonomies are mixed, where the meaning in life is found in sharing experiences, where flourishing is discovered in mingling our lives. The legal self privileges particular activities, those traditionally seen as the world of men, and downplays the importance of care. This sidelining of care and the aggrandizement of economic productivity helps to sustain and reinforce patriarchal oppression of women. Legal cases are presented as being about two people, Smith versus Jones. The rights of each party is weighed up by the judge, and one is declared the winner and the other the loser. In most cases, money must be paid by the winner to the loser. Even in a case where you think relationships may feature, such as family law, we're told to consider what's best for the child alone and warned strongly not to consider the interests of parents. But all that ignores how relationships are central to our identity. We cannot consider a child in isolation from those caring from them. Maybe we need to rethink that the solution of the dispute between Smith and Jones is not in money, but in an apology, in an explanation, some penance. Money rarely mends relationships. Secondly, the importance of care. Kathleen calls for a replacement of the ethics of capitalism with ethics of care, to shift from the ideal being the economically productive citizen to being the caring citizen. Everyone is vulnerable. Vulnerability is commonly used by politicians as a criticism. It justifies intervention and paternalism. Particular groups are identified as being vulnerable and in need of protection. But the claim of universal vulnerability theorists is that being vulnerable is an inevitable part of the human condition. We're all vulnerable. None of us can survive on our own. And if we're all vulnerable, then our caring relationships are absolutely central to our survival. And yet, our caring relationships are also part of what makes us vulnerable. Despite this, care is often invisible to the law. The injured pedestrian can receive compensation for their lost wages, but not for the loss of an ability to care. The welfare recipient is encouraged to find paid employment. Their care work counts for nothing. The GDP of a country is loudly trumpeted by the government, but there is silence over the level of care provided. Our law reports are replete with cases about making, losing, and claiming money. The cases are set in the office, the boardroom, or the casino. Rarely does the nappy changing table, the bedpan, or the care home feature. Our law undergraduates are well trained to advise well-heeled business people on their rights of autonomy, their freedom of contract, and their presumption of innocence. But many are not well equipped to advise the welfare recipient, the exhausted mother of a disabled child, or the care home resident with dementia. The value the law seems to promote and the nature of the self they promote is an anathema to them. And there are two reasons for that, which we've already heard. The concept of privacy, that care is seen as a private matter about which the state need not matter. What happens in individuals' home is of no concern to the state. And the second is autonomy. Autonomy is highly prized by the law. Individuals can choose to care and choose to do so out of love, but they must be aware that the rewards are not financial. The state will respect their choice. But these concepts of privacy and autonomy should be rejected by those who promote a caring law. It should be the primary responsibility of the state to meet the needs of citizens who cannot provide for themselves. By describing care work as private and a choice, the state is given a free ride by not compensating or recognizing the value of the work of those who fulfill the state's responsibility. It leaves women and those involved in care pauperized. It gives rise to a structural debt owed by society to carers. The final topic I want to address is violence and care. In chapter 9 of her book, Kathleen demonstrates the interconnections of violence and care. And this is extremely important, especially for lawyers. In the legal literature, ethics of care is often criticized for being soft and idealistic. It's often characterized as promoting relationships and ignoring issues of violence and justice. But as Kathleen powerfully shows, the opposite is true. It's only by recognizing the significance of care that a wide range of systematic and ingrained forces of social and structural violence can be identified. I just want to say a few words specifically on domestic abuse. Care ethicists are sometimes criticized for promoting relationships and not recognizing that care can be a site of abuse. But I think that's wrong. Only a care-based analysis can fully illustrate the wrongs of domestic abuse. Because it's our caring relationships that give value to our lives. They're meant to be a source of love, support, and flourishing. They're meant to build us up and keep us going when times are tough, to give us meaning beyond ourselves. Yet in domestic abuse, those relationships are used to tear people down, to destroy their sense of self-worth, and to coerce them. The trust that's essential for there to be love is turned back on the victim and used as a weapon of abuse. The home that should be a place of security and comfort is turned into a prison. The shared history that should be a source of joy becomes a tool of terror. Domestic abuse is a fearful, dreadful thing. But our society has ignored domestic abuse for too long. Worse than that, it's enabled, perpetuated, and nourished it by seeing family life as a matter of privacy and as a matter of personal autonomy. But that is a fiction. In domestic abuse, we see for all to see in microcosm the patriarchal forces that are prevalent throughout society. The message that women must obey men, women should be servants of men, women are there for men's enjoyment and to meet their needs. If women depart from these roles, they will be punished and put back in their place. In domestic abuse, patriarchy bears its ugliest face. And the prize of challenging domestic abuse is worth striving for. Intimate lives free from coercive control, or as free as they can be, provide us with the greatest joys life has to offer. They allow care to flourish, but they can only be entered into if there is an effective tool, effective laws and effective protection from domestic abuse. So to conclude, we are vulnerable, interdependent individuals, and our strength and reality lies not in our autonomy or self-sufficiency, but in our relationship with others. As Kathleen's book shows, caring is essential for our own individual well-being, but also for a flourishing society. Care provides joy, value, and meaning for life, but the law and public policy de-emphasizes care, undervalues it, fails to acknowledge it. Most carers receive no financial compensation and bear the economic costs alone. We need to challenge then the image of the independent, self-sufficient man armed with his rights that the law gives him to protect his freedom. We need, as Kathleen Books demands, a legal system and a society which is based around norms of interlocking, mutual dependent relationships. Legal interventions should be designed not to protect individuals or rights, but to uphold and maintain networks of caring relationships. We need to see caring relationships at the heart of the law and of society, because as Kathleen's book shows so powerfully, it is in and through care that ourselves are created. It is in and through care that our lives flourish. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. Again, that's a very, very profound review and discussion about Kathleen's book. And I relate as a lawyer myself to some of the things that you've said, and the fact that the book can actually reach a very, very wide audience. I also thinking, so I don't want to take too much of the time, but thinking about what you said about the concept of the self-interested person, and thinking about other continents, while we have the Convention on Human Rights in Africa, they have the Convention on Human Rights and People's Rights. So there might be other, other ways of approaching and other ways of thinking about the law indeed. I would like to now maybe invite Kathleen maybe to elaborate or to respond to some of the comments or of the points that Diane and Jonathan have made. Maybe, I don't know, about the social mobility and education for Diane, and the three observations and three topics that Jonathan has mentioned, about the concept of the self and the ethics and capitalism and care, and the ethics of capitalism, sorry, and the violence and care. So if you would like to.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for taking the time to read the book. And I suppose I'd say first to Diane, it is interesting that social mobility was regarded as a virtue. I think that people forget that. It was regarded as a great virtue to become socially mobile. But I think what was not foreseen is the myth of meritocracy creates a new arrogance among those who, that Young predicted in 1958 when he wrote about meritocracy. And it is ironic. I always say, as somebody who lived just as a student in England and worked there, in the 70s when I was young, and it struck me what a wonderful country it was, it had great welfare and everything. It's almost like, and I think it's a real lesson for educationists, that the country that gave so much to so many would produce a politics where people did exactly the opposite of what the welfare state actually created for themselves. That astounds me. Now, I know there are probably politicians or people in politics who will say simple majoritarian politics is a problem. Yeah, I think it is. But I suppose in that sense, the socially mobile became the socially conservative and the politically indifferent. And I think there are a lot of questions for educationalists to ask themselves are we producing that? And how are we producing it? I know the social media and political culture and, they are powerful influencers on young people as well. But there is nowhere in public where you are evaluated every day, most days, and ranked hierarchically and rewarded like you are in education for a very, very long time. And I think it does hardwire young people into a consciousness of self-interest. I don't think that's mythical. It's just the logic. To go back to, you mentioned Bourdieu, it is the habitus of education. It is what we do. And I don't think we have, the most we do is we think we will provide, critical thought or we'll expose people to critical theory. I don't know. I go back to Germany and the war. I mean, it was the Second World War and the onset of it is very sophisticated electorate, you could say, relatively speaking, well educated. Just education that only tells us ideas but doesn't teach us to practice, I think is a problem. I do really. I think it's something we have to think about. It's not just the theory of justice, but the practice of justice. And how do we enact that? And how do we institutionalize, or can we? I don't know the answers. I mean, I don't know but I certainly think there is a problem because the indifference that comes when you think you have succeeded, and as I said, the moral kind of approval that goes for self-responsibilization. Self-interested now is coded as self-responsibilization. And then you're made to feel you are morally virtuous, you're only looking after your own, that's your responsibility. Doesn't matter if people are dying of starvation in Eritrea or Somalia or Yemen, it really is not for you. And I think that that is an issue for education. It isn't just how we think, it's how we act. And I don't know the answer because I don't think education has found the answer to that. So I don't know, I just say that just as so just the other thing, I suppose, what I'd say is come back to Jonathan's point. I don't want to delay here in case people want to ask questions, but the concept of the self, I think that is so important, who we think we are. In reality, most people's lives are lived, in relation to others. They see themselves and define themselves, be it their children or grandchildren or their mothers or fathers or sisters or neighbors, or if they're partners, or even their cats and their dogs, or their friends, or, so people have relationships. And so the idea, there is no good dependency in capitalism as we know it. It is a bad thing to be dependent. As I said, it's symbolic that we changed unemployment assistance to worker, what do they call it? Work seekers allowance, So we made them, call them, you must get work. You cannot be unemployed. And that is true in both these islands. We changed the nomenclature and redefined people. Not that you could inevitably be dependent, because some people are unemployable. That is the truth for all kinds of reasons. They won't get work. And that's nothing wrong with people for that. But we have defined it out of the system. So I think that's, for me, and it's reflected in so many walks of life. I've done an analysis of the government websites, for example, which is fascinating, and how they've changed the nomenclature in the public services. And even the revenue commissioners to call people customers in the health service. How could you be a customer in education? It's a human right you have to education. So how can you be a customer? But that nomenclature, and that's what I was saying about neoliberalism, it has pervaded consciousness at a level that we are not aware of. And it's because we do not constantly contest that and reflect it and resist it at every hand's turn. So it is an enormous challenge. I'm not naive. I know how hard it is to bring about social change. But the concept of the self, I think, has to move because we are not autonomous. That is for sure, certain. And I read your book on relational justice. I hope I have the title right. And I found it so inspiring as well, because I felt, oh my God, somebody in law thinks like me. I was beginning to wonder, was I delusional? And it's the same, Diane in my youth, and I know her for a very long time, inspired me well, I keep going about social class when it had gone out of fashion. Poverty is, you know, it's endemic to capitalism, and you can't qualify it. You can't just eliminate it. For goodness sake, that is written into the class system. It's in its fabric. So I'm not saying it's going to change overnight. I'm not that naive. But I think we have to mobilize other ways of thinking and other sites of organization. Why can't we, for example, in our jurisdiction, we're supposed to have, we haven't had it yet, a referendum on reintroducing care as a principle of for the Constitution. It is supposed to happen. The Women's Council have endorsed it. The Citizens' Assembly have endorsed it. And I think that would be hugely significant because it would create a different narrative. I know you don't have a written constitution in the UK, but it was a debate in Chile lately. Unfortunately, the constitution, as you probably know, was defeated. But there was a principle of care being written into the constitution, the new constitution for Chile. So in that sense, I think there is a new concept of the person emerging globally, even if it hasn't taken hold in the islands yet. And the violence, you know, the long arm of the law always relies on violence in terms of protecting property, in terms of protecting institutions. You know, I suppose it's personal, very personal for me, because for the last week, I have a young man who's staying in and out with me, who's out of prison for his other many health and mental health issues, and for theft mostly, and minor things, robbing beer. And, you know, theft, as you know, is taking something but without violence. And I often think, why is he in prison? Because ultimately violence is used against everybody by the institutions of the state. And we had the Shells to Sea campaign here, where local people who were protesting against putting, you know, the oil and pipes too near people's houses they were arrested and they were imprisoned. So violence is very much part of the state. And I know you spoke about it domestically. And of course, the privacy issue of the family is an enormous issue, because once you define somewhere as private, then people can be susceptible to anything. So absolutely, I think violence is a huge problem, and people who talk about care don't talk about violence. I think, especially in sociology, maybe in law they do, but I think it is a very big question, because you need to bring the two discourses together, because they're very closely related. So I leave it at that. That's all right. Give people, thank you very much again for all your kind and helpful comments. Thank you. I appreciate it.
Thanks so much, Kathleen. Thanks very much. So before leaving the floor to the Q&A, I like this notion of social mobility, and this, I agree with you when you say there is a perverse outcome with the meritocracy system, which is, you know, pushed at the extreme. We have an expression in French, in the French language, where we talk about the social lift, which allows you from, you know, from maybe a lower class to actually reach the top. And there is a discussion in France at the moment that this social lift is blocked. It doesn't work anymore. And that's, you know, the perversion of this system, which doesn't work anymore. It doesn't give opportunities to people. So and that's a very interesting point, I think. So I would like to invite questions from the floor. If there are some, I don't know if Ruben, you have some questions in.
There's not so far, but if I may, while the audience thinks of some questions, I was just thinking concretely, how would law, how can care be made more visible within the law? How would that look in practice? Sort of, you know, if you think of, say, domestic abuse, for example, just to go back to Jonathan's point, what would that look like? Just as I'm asking as a sociologist who's clueless about the law.
So what's striking is that there are a few occasions on which suddenly care does get valued. So a good example is on divorce. Certainly in English law, the courts in a leading decision called White and White said that the caring by the wife was of equal value to the money making by the husband. And so in that case, they had to therefore equally divide the assets. But what I think is striking is that it's only care in the context of marriage that gets valued like that. A cohabitant who'd done exactly the same care would, for example, have received no work. And it's also childcare that is always mentioned. I don't know of any case where care of older people or other people needing care is taken into account. And even there, it's only seen as a responsibility that typically the husband will have to pay some form of compensation to the wife for that work. It's not still seen as a state thing. But so we do there have some scope there for the law recognizing and valuing care, but it's only done in a very particular a narrow set of circumstances.
Thank you, Jonathan. Adding to that, it's true that in all the systems, it's very difficult, again, to quantify this care. And in a jurisdiction, you need, and before the judges, you just need to have evidence and proof, of the care to be able to provide for the the amount of care which was provided. So that's always very practical and very pragmatic before a court of law. If I may, I have a question to Kathleen about this concept of, as a constitutionalist myself, I'm very interested in this discussion about reintroducing the notion of care in the Constitution, which I understand is different from the notion of common good.
Yeah. Sorry, but I think the debate about it, I suppose, is, you know what it is, you know perfectly well. It's about removing the current provision, which is But I think it's a long time ago now, but when I was on the Constitution Review Group in 1996, one of the recommendations we made was to try and find an articulation of a care principle which was gender neutral, but would recognise the forms of care that Jonathan is talking about, because care is not just childcare. And the other thing is, the other issue that I think is very serious, which isn't really discussed very much, is it's almost like the sexual contract between people who are married is the basis of care. Oh, I'm not so sure. Because I think sexual contracts are generally pretty volatile. And I'm always surprised at me that actually people think that that should be the basis on which you would define care. Because, for example, brothers and sisters, you find in many parts of rural Ireland, you'll have single people together, two sisters, two brothers, caring for one another into their old age. And for example, I don't care whether they're married or not, but if they live on a small farm and they've nothing else, one of them happens to be bequeathed it, and then if they die, the other has nothing. They have no entitlement to it, even though, in fact, they are their primary carer and they are effectively a couple in contract through care to one another, even if it's not, if you like, a sexual contract. And that does surprise me, because I think there are many ways in which human beings set up life, if you want to put it that way, in which they actually give an awful lot of care to one another. And I think it's that sense. And also, of course, I would love it if we took care of the environment and we could, and care of other species, which I think, as I talk about in the book, how the anthropocentrism of thinking about other animals and how we use language where we neutralize them and therefore we see them as products and we use and abuse them. And that is so true in this country. And it is a taboo subject. You cannot talk about it because the meat, as it's called, another neutralized word, that actually denies the feelings and sensitivities of mammals, which are the very same as human beings in many, many areas in terms of suffering. So that was the context in which, if you like, that's what my knowledge of it is, Marilyn. I mean, it's not, I think it's about having that universal principle. How it would be articulated in law is, of course, another matter altogether. But it was about creating something that would supersede, if you like, where, private property is so strong and so well protected. And it was to try and bring in something new. And now, in fairness to this country, as you know, we do have carers allowance, and we have one of the equality grounds is the family status ground. And on the commission, we're looking and calling, I think, a number of people, whether it'll happen or not, I don't know, should be called the care ground, that you can't discriminate on the care ground. But that's an important part of Irish law. It's not incidental. People actually do use it Yes, so I think that's another, and that's maybe not your question, but that's what
No, yes, it's a question. It's a sense of the question, and I suppose it will evolve because we can see even ageism, when the population will age, and I think care will take a center place, in this discussion, and I think the mentalities will evolve as that they have evolved in non-marital relationship, for example, talking about my country, where we recognize the family and married people as the unit, but now obviously a couple who is cohabitating without being married is as well recognized as carers for each other. So it's slow to evolve. The law follows the society, and but that's good signs for having this evolution in that sense. If there are questions from the audience, I don't know if someone is
I haven't seen any questions. I would encourage attendees to feel free to submit any questions or comments they may have. That would be very welcome.
Or we allow you to talk if you would like. We can allow you to.
Yes.
Talk. And I've if you allow me, I have another question about the notion of I mean, the movements that you mentioned at the end of one of your slides, the different movements, and this is a sign of changes as well that people are, rallying about. But it's larger than the care that we have just discussed. This is really care, in different settings, but the care of the different world order that you're evoking. So we can relate to movement maybe like the Yellow Vest movement, which has happened in France, and it was not just a movement for it was an all-encompassing movement because there were people from different backgrounds, not just minorities or etc. It was just people who needed to use their car, and the people who need to use their car, they live in the countryside, and they were the one who were impacted by this 80 kilometers change that the government wanted to make. So that's very interesting because it was a very massive and very violent, but originally it was not violent. It was infiltrated by people who made it violent. And I believe it was not violent at the start. So people were really genuine in what they wanted from the government and in the country. It was to put back a certain sense of social justice, that it was not, listening to these people. So I think it's very interesting when you mention the different movements around the world about what their, claims were.
Well, I think people are not evil. People, do want a more socially just world. I'm just mentioning one thing, which is an ethic of care. I think it's a very powerful ethic because if we think relationally, and if we think, especially, I suppose, of something like human suffering and the suffering of other species, we begin to think of the world very differently. It is about hardwiring our brain to think very differently. It's not something we're socialized to do. And I'd love if Diane came in on social mobility and that, because it, as you know more about, you've written an awful lot about it. And it isn't that people wanted to be superior, but they wanted often the very basic goods and services that they saw middle-class people having, which they did not have. They wanted a decent life, And I think that that's what, when people, I'm not critiquing it, I'm just saying the irony of it is, in my point of view, when they got it, when it happens, and it's happening here, of course, as well. But what I'm saying is people often want a decent life. They want to have enough and security. And I think we need new language. A lot of people want security. They want security, precarity. We're in an age of high precarity. And people want security, not just care security, but economic security. And how do we get that? So maybe Diane might come in because she's written an awful lot about that.
Yeah, I mean, what I was thinking when the two of you were talking is that actually people are made unhappy by deeply unequal societies. The people at the bottom feel unrecognized, unvalued, humiliated, full of shame. But the people at the top are wary and watchful and feel that they can't trust anybody and are frightened of losing the extra they've got that they really aren't entitled to. And I think it's interesting. Social mobility, as Kathleen said, is a very individualized process, but it's also asset stripping the working classes. You know, a caring society would raise the class in the same way as hopefully raise the race and women as a category too. I mean, we need much more equality and fairness for in order to enhance everybody's sense of well-being and happiness.
Thanks very much, Diane. I'm very aware of the time, and I think we've reached the a half hour. So I mean 6:30. So I think that was an amazing discussion, and maybe Kathleen, we can pursue the discussion. And now we are in contact with each other. I think that's a fascinating book. That's a very interesting discussion that can relate to the many jurisdictions that we know, we were happy to actually know about your next project, and and also about Jonathan and Diane's projects as well. So you're very welcome to UCD again if you want to join us for other events. And thanks again for this wonderful talk and this wonderful evening. I wish you all the guests and the presenter, the author,